Ollie, walk us through what we've been hearing from Zelensky vis-à-vis its NATO ambitions.
Yeah, and that follows a meeting that we had yesterday in Berlin with Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Volodymyr Zelenskiy, Friedrich Merz. We understand those talks will continue into today with a number of other European leaders also joining. But, Tom, what we're getting to is this word, NATO. And NATO is a fundamental premise on both sides of this war. For the Ukrainians, of course, it's seen, its membership is seen as really one of the only ways that it can effectively deter Russian invasion. That's why, Ukraine has for a very long time wanted to join NATO. And it is seen from the other side by Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, as one of these so-called sort of instigating reasons that the war began, because of his perception and his idea that NATO is not really, strictly speaking, a defensive alliance, but something that is seeking to encroach further and further upon Russia. So the question is there a way to sort of split that in the negotiations to provide the Ukrainians with the kinds of security guarantees, the Article 5-like or Article 5 light guarantees backed by the United States, backed by the Europeans, while also reassuring to some degree the Russians that this is not in fact a sort of NATO expansion. For the Ukrainians, this is obviously giving something up because this is in some ways curtailing their own sovereignty. It's basically accepting from the externality what sort of alliances they can join. Obviously, from the Russians, there's a question of whether this would go sort of far enough in reassuring them that this would sort of diminish the so-called root causes that the Russians have identified, this NATO membership. So I think that, again, with all of these negotiations, these are sort of forward progress, potentially. That being said, we have not heard from the Russians in quite a long time about this negotiation process and how they feel about the now 20-point plan. But that is the conversation that we get going into this week, and as we expect more discussions to happen in Berlin today.
Yeah, and Ollie, as you well know, of course, and it's going to be keeping you busy through the week, a major week for European leaders this final week of the year, final full week of the year at least. Other European leaders then, Ollie, are set to join these talks later today. What are you going to be watching for there?
Yeah, so we'll have about 10 European leaders. We're also going to have Ursula von der Leyen will be in attendance. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, will also be in attendance. And, those discussions about the peace plan will be front and center. But as you allude to, Tom, later in the week is, I think, one of the most fundamental questions here for European leaders. The will they or won't they on the Russian assets, the big question about whether or not the European Union and its member states will seize or in some way try to monetize those Russian assets to try to fund Ukraine into the years to come. That 90 billion euros worth of loans that they're supposed to be presenting to the Ukrainians, which found also some more resistance just before the weekend, Tom. We understand that now Italy and Bulgaria and Malta have written a letter to the European Commission to suggest finding alternative routes of funding for the Ukrainians other than the Russian assets. So you take one step forward by sort of having the sort of legislative change that we had on Friday that basically cuts out Hungary, while taking one step back by getting resistance from the other leaders. What we'll find out today, Tom, is if the year of sort of geopolitical humiliation for the Europeans continues by another failure of them to assert themselves on this issue.